I see a number of people who were here yesterday were here again today. We'll build a little bit on what we were doing yesterday as we start to look at Tai Chi practice. Of course, it's a regular attendee of the classes, and familiar with what we're talking about. We're going to start again with head carriage, floating the head back and the crown of the head up. And then a gentle lift and spreading of the upper back as movement connects down through the spine, out through the shoulders, down through the arms, spreading the palms a little bit. We can relax back towards casual posture and initiate from the head again. Head back, crown up, the spine is gently lengthening. At the same time, we sit back a little into the hips. Weight stays even to the heel. As we lengthen, expand gently the whole back of the body, we feel the front of the body inside gently enclosed. And relax back. Sitting back, we feel a little bit of a crease. Fold at the hips, just the top of the thigh, and knees are also soft. Letting the tailbone sink under the body as we let the lower back lengthen. And the pelvis rotate back. Bones tilting backward, the tailbone dropping under the body. So it gets down through the feet, you feel the weight even and apart. Feel the feet as if they're both spreading slightly and also very lightly gripping the floor. As the weight sinks down, we also feel the breath collecting in the lower abdomen. We're going to rock the weight gently forward and back, about 70%. And the feet spread a little bit more as I go forward, and then the arches lift, that gentle grasping with forward as I come back. Trying to let that happen spontaneously, not putting too much effort into it, either muscular or mental. Side to side. Each foot adjusts slightly as the weight comes into it, again about 70%. Relaxing down through one side, straight into the ground. We start to feel as if we're sinking down a little bit into that leg. Not lowering the body visibly too much, but it has that sensation. You can feel deepening at the hip and knee, the ankle. We want to imagine that the body is very gently compressed like a spring, right? Especially the foot and ankle. Maybe we can feel it up into the hip area. And then if we release the foot and ankle, release that gently compressed spring, it lifts us up through the center. In the middle, I don't straighten my legs, I keep a little bend, and sink down subtly a little into the other side. The weight shift always involves kind of sinking or releasing down into the newly weighted leg. That release comes all the way down through the body, down right from the top, so the shoulders are nice and soft, releasing down through the spine. If I go back to the front to back, weight shift. So something a little bit similar, quite different in some ways. We feel the feet pressing and spreading out, and then arches grasping, lifting. Feels a little like a drawing up, connects to a sense again of lift up through the body. Particularly, we're looking for that sense of lift and support up through the inner legs, up through the pelvic floor, up through the deep abdomen, right at the front of the spine, all the way to the crown of the head. So forward, it's more of a releasing downward feeling. Back, it's like a pumping action in the feet. We're drawing water, something up from the ground into the body. And then if I make a circle with my weight, it's going to involve all those kinds of motion a little bit. I don't want to micromanage it. So relax my mental model of what's going on and just sort of feel those changes, even if I can't quite define them. Initially, it's more important that I feel the weight smoothly sinking down through the body, any excess tension dropping away. And then I allow the breath to start to collect, connect with the abdomen. Closing in the center, then I'll circle a few times the other way. Head carriage is still important here. Head floating back. We're back rounded, releasing out through the shoulders and arms, as well as down through the whole body. And then notice that my breath is quite a bit slower than the circle movement. There's no coordination between the circle of the body and the slow, deep, even, and relaxed breath. Pause in the center. And then an exercise that we typically start with, and what we did yesterday as well, lifting up a little bit, keeping the chin in, lifting up through the crown, releasing the weight down. Down with the same dynamics. Eyes about 45 degrees up, 45 degrees down, not staring too far down at the floor. Getting a nice even sense of pull down the front of the body as the back shortens, and then a nice even pull down the back as the front line shortens a bit. Here the breath might start falling in time with the movement. Doesn't have to, but if it does, making sure I'm moving slowly enough that the breath is slow and relaxed. Side to side. Same intention of feeling that lift up through the crown, but releasing the way down, especially through the opposite hip and shoulder. Letting one side lengthen as the other side shortens, which is our basic yin-yang relationship. Lengthens, gently stretched side is active and yang. The shorter side feels like it's gently consolidated, gathering in to that plane, which is the yin action. And then in a circle. And again, I abandoned some of the very specific modeling of what's happening here, just to emphasize in a smooth movement, even relaxed. The same things are happening. Lengthening the front plane, lengthening one side, then going back, going around, you reach and turn. If it's easy to attend to those feelings, then you can. But if it's a little distracting, then we're not going to micromanage it or try to be too specific. Pause, reverse. Maybe be able to feel the change down in the feet. It's actually clearly defined, just noticing how even while the lower body is stable, not moving outwardly, and still feel the influence of that upper body movement, reaching down through. And we're going to turn from the top. So initially just the head. It's going to involve only the upper few joints of the neck, the vertebra. Very gentle. Same basic posture, working down through the neck gradually. Adding one or at most two joints at a time. So it takes a little while to work down through the whole neck and then right into the upper torso. Feeling that twist reaching under the collarbones, to the upper back, just above the shoulder blades. Area that's hard to get moving a little bit. Arms rotate too once I get down there, giving me a little leverage on those upper ribs, spine, working down through the mid chest, right across the shoulder blades. And as the weight sinks down, it stabilizes the lower body so that I don't see any external twist in the waist yet. I may feel again that pull reaching down through that area, even down through the hips and legs. There's a difference between that subtle kind of stretch and pull that's along the connective tissue or channels in the Chinese sense, and any kind of visible outer movement and rotation of the joints. Distinguishing the kind of movement that happens in parts of the body that are outwardly stable. The kind of sensation we feel when the body is clearly in outward motion. Let's bring the same ranges of motion a little deeper into the body now. So I've really been focusing here through the head and neck, the upper back and chest, and up to about mid-chest height. Now let's do the same things and bring it just a little bit lower. So again, initiating from the top. Now my eyes are going to be quite a bit lower, higher, not because I'm moving my head more, but because I'm allowing that movement to reach further down through the spine. A little additive. Working arms rotate, I can. As we've discussed before, I can feel that kind of exchange between the stretched out surface, the yang surface, and the shortened surface, the yin. The idea of exchanging, of this kind of counterbalance between parts of the body is very important to Tai Chi. In fact, it's very much what the name Tai Chi refers to, which is the axis of this kind of exchange, kind of pivot point, or axis between yang and yin. Side to side. Again, I see the visible motion now getting down into the waist area. But the hips stay stable, so I still need to sink my weight, drop the tailbone under the body, sit back a little bit in the hips so that my pelvis stays still as I move more of the spine. Tai Chi always engages this kind of balance between what is externally moving and what is externally stable. Full circle again. It's a bigger circle, it feels like the waist area is the pivot point between the moving upper body and the stationary lower body. But I never stiffen the lower body trying to hold it still. It's how I drop my weight that just makes it still without any significant effort. And I feel the muscles of the legs working a little bit just because they're supporting my weight, not because I'm putting any extra tension there. Then looking to the side, again, I can start with the head. I'm going to work down through the neck a little more quickly this time, into the upper back and chest. Within a few repetitions, getting down and through the mid back, the lower ribs, and the waist area. All the pelvis and hips remain stationary. And now if we want to work on the lower body, in this case, we're going to stabilize the upper body against that lower body movement gently. So I'm going to place my hands on my low back, just primarily right now to help me feel how the shape of the lower back changes. So if I'm a little more consciously tuck my tailbone under, feel how the lower back stretches out, how the low back muscles press into the palms, keep your shoulders relaxed. And then sort of untuck the tailbone, lift it back, and feel how that lower back curve falls in. So if we were doing bows forward or toe touches or something, we find we can move the lower back, flex and extend the lumbar spine without necessarily changing the tilt in the pelvis. But this shows us that we can't change the pelvic tilt without changing the curve of the lower back. So the relationship's not entirely symmetrical. Lower back can move kind of independently of the pelvis. Anything we do with the pelvis is going to affect the lumbar spine very directly. And I also, as much as I feel this tuck untuck moving up through my spine, I may also feel it pushing down through my legs into the feet and feel a little bit of that pressing and grasping that I felt before with the weight shift. I can also sway the hip side to side so that one hip sinks down towards the floor and the other one lifts. And that's going to require me to let one knee bend a little bit, help that hip drop. It's useful to think of the knee as always tracking in the same direction as the feet, or tracking over the feet. So when the knee bends, it moves straight towards the toes. As it straightens, it moves back towards the ankle or heel. And it's only an inch or so. It's not a big motion, but there's no inward deviation of the knee here. In Tai Chi, you generally want to avoid any internal or external deviation of the knee. Always a nice smooth tracking, front to back, parallel with the foot. So it can help if your feet are a little straighter than they might normally be. We don't want to force that. If I tend to stand with my toes out, though, I want to at least toe in slightly. Help create that nice straight tracking. So if my toes are out slightly, my knee's going to follow them. If my feet are a little straighter and that's comfortable, again, the knees are going to be moving a little bit more straight forward and back. Once I get that side to side feeling, then I can shoot the full circle. And you'll see my head's not going anywhere. My shoulders are stable. In fact, the chest, the whole upper body. I can feel how this movement works up through the waist a little bit. Because the waist intersects right in the middle of the lumbar and the low back area. Pause and reverse the direction. And now we can also initiate the twist from down here. So if I'm standing about body width and sitting down and slightly back into the hips a little bit, help drop the tailbone under again. So this feels a little different from that conscious tucking that I was doing before, which feels like it involves a little bit of muscular work, hopefully very gentle, not stiff or coarse. But here it's this sitting back that sort of automatically lets my tailbone drop onto the body and makes the low back feel a little more full, the spine a little straight. And that can take a while to get the hang of that. But it's a useful position. It does a number of things, one of which is it helps really lead my weight down. It drops my center of gravity and helps root my legs to the floor. It lengthens and releases the lower back a little bit, helps reduce stress in that area. It can help guide some of that feeling of the breath from the lower abdomen to the lower back as well. So that I feel my breath reaching the lower abdomen, the expansion's not just to the front. It's not just one direction, but it's like a ball. It's the top of the diaphragm is pressing down as I inhale, which is what inhalation is. Sinking down at the top of the diaphragm as well as a lift around the edges, the rib cage. Presses down to the abdominal contents, which are going to expand in all directions. When we feel it mostly in the front, part of that is because we have less tension, less muscle tension there, and certainly less sort of bony structure to resist the movement than we do in other places. But this posture helps open and relax the lower back so I can start to feel that breath more three-dimensionally. And this doesn't have to do with mentally trying to control the shape of the breath or even get it down to my abdomen. I want to do all that really by virtue of the posture and that sense of dropping the weight. So if I put my hands on the hip bones now, the hip joints are right below the hip bones, right where the femur, the thigh bone fits in at the bottom, and right where we have a very clear crease, the hip. And so I'm going to turn a little bit to one side and another, and I want to notice, again, another yin-yang pair. We can think of the side where the body is turning into the thigh as the inside. So closing up, gathering. And the other side, the other hip, is yang. It's stretching open a little bit. If that back leg falls or twists in, then I lose that feeling. Then I don't get that little bit of stretch, and that leg ceases to be a nice, stable support. I feel one side fold in, the other side stretch it. Even the head carriage is still important here because it's how I initiate that release of my weight down that keeps the legs stable. I may again feel a little bit of movement in the knee, not very much, at most an inch, and it kind of tracking forward and back in the two knees, never an inward deviation. So we describe the two thighs like an arch. If we were doing a wider, deeper stance, but with essentially the same relationship, same posture, we call it a horse riding stance. This is a bit too upright to really qualify, but it's got the same sensibility. It's an arch here, right? If I think of it like sitting in a saddle, it's more like sitting on a merry-go-round, a very small, narrow horse. And initially, I feel that rotation really just in my hips. But if I let my arms sway, like two heavy pieces of rope, then I can feel how that twist starts to reach up into my lower back a little bit. Start to get into the joints, the back of the pelvis, the sacroiliac joint, and up into the lumbar spine just a little bit. My arms are quite loose, but they're not limp. And one way I can keep my arms from being limp or slack is to spread my palms and fingers just slightly. Not stiffly, just enough to keep the arm feeling kind of awake and not limp and dead. especially right before the hands pat the body. A little percussion. If I open my hand, the percussion will feel just a little stronger without having to really add any effort. And I can feel that percussion sort of radiating out into the tissues, helping to relax the musculature, soften, and also help stimulate the circulation. There are a number of channel cavities, aka acupuncture points, in this area around the front of the hip bones and also back around the back of the pelvis, sacroiliac joint, and lower back, that are very good for, are used, not surprisingly, for releasing this area and also improving communication between the upper and lower body. And there's an important vessel in acupuncture called the belt or girdling vessel that wraps the area right from the back of the waist over the hip bones and just under the navel, which is important for the sort of upper and lower body communication. Yet another yin-yang pair, upper body being yang and light, sky, lower body being stable, firm, related to the earth, which is a good recipe for balance. And I can work that turning up from the bottom, letting the upper body twist it a bit more until it gets up at least to the waist. At a certain point, I may feel like my hands are starting to swing a little higher than the hip bones, patting the lower ribs even, but I try to let that just develop naturally. This area around the lower ribs is really interesting because it's the intersection of some major shoulder muscles. We don't usually think of our shoulders down here, but of course they are. If you think about the lats, the latissimus dorsi, and the serratus anterior muscles, those are shoulder muscles that are attached both to the arm in the case of the latissimus dorsi and to the shoulder blade. And then also the external oblique abdominal muscles that reach up, and the external ones reach over the ribs, and they all sort of knit together in a kind of zigzag or checkerboard pattern through this area. So it's a really important intersection area for support and activation that again connects the upper and lower body, which is a very important idea in Tai Chi. Channel theory. There's an important cavity there that's considered the starting place of the great luo or great vessel of the spleen, which is in reference, very different from Western anatomy, in reference to digestion and the transmission of nutrients throughout the whole body to invigorate all the tissues, in this case specifically referring to what's happening really in the chest and in the limbs. So the idea that working this area helps actually strengthen and stabilize the limbs by giving them nutritional support. Speaking of the limbs, we'll then move up a little bit into the shoulders themselves. I'm just going to lift one shoulder and then the other. So we're working our way very slowly through what's normally just warm-ups, and we move through very quickly. Although I don't like the term warm-up so much in English. In Chinese, they're more called jiben gong, which is foundation skills. and that we're learning skills and a kind of body map and awareness that's going to be required for anything sophisticated we do. There's always a layering this kind of art up. That whatever the first lessons are, those lessons have to be maintained and carried through any other upcoming exercises, any exercises further down the road. I'm going to put one hand just close to my neck, from those upper shoulder, upper back muscles, easiest, and try to differentiate when I lift my shoulder between lifting the whole shoulder together as one big chunk and lifting the outer shoulder in rotation. So it's the second one that we're really after, where this area close to the neck stays soft, sinking, and relaxed as I lift the outer shoulder. Let's put one on the other side. And just that gentle pressure of the weight of your hand also makes it much easier to feel exactly what's going on in that area and how to keep that area soft. You'll notice that I'm sort of doing one shoulder at a time rather than lifting both shoulders. So when I lift both shoulders, it's actually very hard to keep this area sinking and soft and relaxed. And it's hard to keep that sense of the weight sinking down and the breath sinking down into the abdomen. It's not impossible, but especially in the beginning, when I lift both up, I may start to feel like my breath is kind of tight in my chest. And I want to promote that soft, sinking feeling. That's one of the main strategies for maintaining a sense of relaxation as we do Tai Chi. And then I'm going to shrug the shoulders forward a little bit and back, making space between my shoulder blades and then gently squeezing them together. This is a much bigger range of motion for the shoulder blade than we will use in most exercises. But it's not a bad one to start off with, just to get everything moving. Then I'm going to make a nice big round circle with one shoulder. And here again, I may start to really develop some awareness of that area of the lower ribs, that intersection point, serratus muscles that reach under the arm, kind of like ribs, the latissimus dorsi, the big muscle that forms the back of the armpit and reaches down to those lower ribs and also throughout the lower back, attaching to the spine and connective tissue, connecting all the way to the back of the pelvis. So having really a very broad field of effect, as well as that gentle feeling of stretch or pull in the abdominal muscles. Reverse the circle. Sides. Reverse. And then we'll make a nice big circle with the arm. Again, I'm going to put my hand right around that area, wherever under the arm, just a comfortable place to put my hand. Then I make a very relaxed, empty fist. Draw a nice big circle with the whole arm. Listening for a very similar feeling through that area, as well as, again, above, trying to keep that area soft and sinking. And dropping the weight, sitting back a little in the hips, not forgetting the basic posture. Again, my breath would probably be quite a bit slower than the movement of my arm here. If they fall in time, that's fine. But generally, we want to emphasize a very slow, deep, relaxed breath. So I might find that I'm inhaling through one full circle and exhaling through the next full circle. I'm not trying to make that happen exactly, but just to give you an idea of how the breath can be quite independent of that arm movement. A lot of the breath training in Tai Chi is quite indirect. You want to be aware of it. The primary goal initially is just feel it slow, deep, even down the abdomen. Whole abdomen initially is fine. Gradually, perhaps feeling it's concentrated even a little bit lower down below the navel. We'll work on the legs a little bit. I take a little wider stance. Put my hands on my low back again to help me feel the tailbone dropping under, not aggressively tucking. And then sway the hips forward and backward. I'm going to keep my eyes level and gazing out to the distance. And that way, hopefully stabilizing the position of my head. So lower body swaying back and forth, with my head staying in place. Feel a little of that yin-yang exchange again. And my hips are forward, the front is lengthened and stretched, the back is shortened, and then versus as hips sway back. Side to side. Circle. Again, you'll notice my head is just hanging out in the middle, centered between my feet. Hips make that big circle. And again, the breath nice and slow and deep, significantly slower than movement, if that's comfortable. Pause and reverse. So the tilt of my pelvis here is remaining about the same, if I can manage that. The tailbone's always slung under the body a little bit. Lumbar is straight, long. So most of the movement's in the hip joints themselves down here. Pause. Step in. I'm going to take a bit of a narrower step and sink the weight down into one leg to lift the other. Initially, just be the heel that comes up on the lighter foot. It's that same sense of sinking down into the ground, perhaps feeling a little spring-like compression in the foot and ankle. I can feel a similar kind of thing happening up at the hip. We're sitting in, sinking down and back a little bit into that hip, even better. Coordination between the foot and ankle and the hip area, which includes the upper thigh, pelvis, low abdomen, and even the low back. And let that light foot come all the way off the floor. And thinking of dropping the weight like a dart right down through that leg, so that I'm not leaning out to the side or swaying my hip out for balance. That's a very crude kind of counterbalance. Finding it in a much more erect, vertical position. Obviously, you can see my whole trunk move a little to the side, centered over one leg. There's not the sense of sort of loose swaying or leaning out. The idea that sitting down is what lifts the leg, another counterbalance idea. And that it's not just the standing hip that I feel that in, but really both hips. It's a feeling like I'm sitting back into both hips, and that bends both my knees. One knee is just bending very slightly, the standing one, and the other one, much more obviously, eventually high enough so that the top of the thigh is about level with the floor, the side of the heel is about next to the side of the knee. Then I'm going to put one foot out in front of the body a little bit, along with the opposite hand. And sway them both out to the side and in through the center. The standing leg here, the knee is still a little bent. I'm sitting back a little bit into the hip. Then the tailbone sink under the body. It's the same posture, really. The arm that's opposite to the standing leg is hanging down, the weight sinking down a little bit, help create a counterbalance, stability. I'm going to try to keep the other hip and shoulder quite loose, so they really sway or swing quite freely. Change sides, sink down a little bit. Think of sitting back into that one leg to carry the other foot forward, even in the setup using counterbalances. We'll do more of these. Sit back this time, front to back. So the right foot is loose. Forward with the opposite arm, and back. I'm going to try to keep the sole of the foot parallel to the floor the whole time. So there'll be a little movement in the ankle, just toes pointing just slightly when the foot swings forward. Change sides. Shake out the legs a little bit. The arms, check the time. Good. So far, everything we're doing could easily be Qigong or Daoyin exercises. These kinds of basic skills overlap a lot with therapeutic exercises in the Chinese tradition. The thing we've been talking about that is sort of leans a little bit more to Taiji specifically is that sense of compressing the spring and releasing it. And sinking down, compressed, that yin activity, releasing up from the ground, all the way up back through the body. So these actions, right, sinking starts at the crown, sinks down through the trunk and the legs and the arms all simultaneously. When we release up, though, it's a little bit more directional. It's really like a line or a wave-like motion that releases up and typically out through the arms, so that reaches the crown and the fingertips at the end of this wave-like release back upward. So down starts from the crown, but we often say we sink the hips and shoulders together, then the elbows and knees together, and the hands and feet. So the limbs are releasing downward in parallel, right, simultaneously. So it starts at the root of the limbs, hips and shoulders, and ends up at the extremities. But when I release back up, it's a movement that comes up through the legs initially, up through the torso, and then out to the hands. So it's not parallel, the down and up. They have a sort of unique, different quality, each one. So we saw that a little bit in the arm swing exercise. Sinking down, right, when we did if we add a weight shift, it'll make it more clear. So if I sink down as I shift my weight to one side, and then release up and into a turn. So in this case, I'm turning away from the weighted leg, and then sinking back down through the center, into the new leg, and then release up into the turn. So I'm returning to the front, shifting my weight, sinking down, releasing up, and continuing the turn to the opposite side. So when I sink down, everything down together, right? Yes, there's a sort of top-down kind of feeling, but again, it's reaching the hands and feet at the same time. But releasing up, it's more directional. It's up and out through the arms, so that everything arrives there toward the end. Now, it doesn't take a long time for this wave to propagate through the body, but it does take a little time. So it's quite noticeable. Let's take a slightly wider stance. And we'll do a slightly different version of that swing. There's so many different swinging exercises. Here I'm going to sink my weight down through one leg and then through the other. So releasing up through the center, sinking down into the next leg. Releasing up through the center, sinking down. The time is a little different from the exercise I was explaining. Each time I sink down, again, you'll see that nice rounded arch, since it's much closer to that classic horse riding stance. And so as I release up through the center, I'm going to let that wave travel up and out through my arms. Let it lift my arms. And then as I sink down, lower the arms. And I'm going to turn to the same side that I'm shifting. It's actually a simpler coordination. Release up and out, and sink down, releasing down through the arms and legs simultaneously. Up from the legs, out through the arms, and down. Now I'm exaggerating a little bit the up and down to help make it visible on camera. It doesn't have to be much at all. What's important is the internal dynamic, not the external movement. But normally in the beginning, a little external movement makes it much easier to feel. But I'm never going to stand all the way up straight. And as I sink down, it's not a very deep squat at all. So I'm up and down maybe an inch or so. But again, I can feel as I sink down, loading the foot and ankle, loading the hip, creating a little potential for that release back up and out to the fingertips. So this starts to look much more like a very Tai Chi specific exercise. If I bring my feet in a little closer, we can do something that looks like the classic slow and even Yang style or Yang family Tai Chi, where I'm going to look down slightly, sink the weight, shoulders and hips, elbows, knees, hands and feet, releasing down. I'm going to let my palms turn a little bit to the rear as I do this. And part of what's driving that is that when I look down, my back is becoming a little rounder, my shoulders a little broader. What I want to avoid is feeling like I'm collapsing or sinking. So my head isn't going to drop or fall forward. My chest isn't going to become concave. It's more accurate to describe the shoulders as feeling broader than rolling forward, which I generally would like to avoid. That's the problem many of us have already, right? Head forward, shoulders forward, right? Cell phone posture. So here, when the back rounds, I feel this gentle kind of enclosing of the chest center, kind of deepening of the chest, but never a sagging or collapsing of the chest. Which for many years in this country, in the way Tai Chi was being taught and the language used, seemed to be what was being suggested. It still exists in many books in English. Whereas you never see anything even vaguely like that in Chinese texts. And when you meet Chinese teachers, they ask what you're exactly trying to do by that. Chinese to say, you're trying to kill yourself? Why would you do that? So kind of broadening of the back and feeling how that promotes that rotation of the palms backward. Loading the legs, feeling the ankles and hips, and then releasing up through the body and out through the arms. So the fingertips are reaching forward here, but the shoulders are sinking down into the body at the same time. The hips have to sink back and settle. So here's another coordination, shoulder and hip together. And release up. Sink down to prepare, the gaze is lowered just slightly. Look up and out to the horizon. The wave releasing up and out through the arms. But everything sort of arrives at the same time. Even though it's initiated in the feet and ends in the hands, it's not like the movement in the legs stops at any point while the arms are still moving. That takes a little while to feel that kind of coordination. So at the end of this lift, still feels like something's happening down in my legs. And then sinking, hips and shoulders, elbows and knees, hands and feet. So by the end it feels almost as if my hands are resting on the floor, very much like the feet are receiving the weight of the uppermost body. The weight of my head, neck, shoulders, and arms, making the palms feel a little heavy. And then raising the eyes again, just release down into the ground with the weight, but at the same time, I'm releasing up through the body, a very subtle version of that same releasing the spring, bottom to top. Eyes look out to the distance very softly, and then sinking down. Load the legs first, prepare. Release up and out. The hands will feel as if they're rolling over a ball or a barrel. And sinking down. My eyes just dropping a few degrees, probably not even 45 minutes. And by the time I reach the end, the gaze is starting to lift. So 2 phases for each repetition. The yin phase, prepare, the yang phase, release up and outward. Another yin phase as you sink down, And this very subtle yawn phase at the end, you return back to the initial position. And here's another movement, the Tai Chi commencement, where the breath can be completely independent of the movement. It may fall in time with it, so you might find yourself inhale, exhale, which is fine. But the breath needs to be very slow and deep and even. That's far more important than getting it timed with the movement. And so letting it be sort of independent of the movement gets the breath a little slower, deeper, and more relaxed. That's the way we want to go. And I'm going a little quickly here just to get more repetitions in. The movement could be done much slower than that, certainly. Shouldn't be done much faster than that most of the time. So here in the commencement, what one of my teachers called actually the most difficult movement of the form, even though the choreography does not seem very complex. We're making a complete change in how we're utilizing and experiencing the body. I think what he described it as the most difficult movement of the form. Going from sort of casual, everyday posture, to normal awareness and postural dynamics, to doing Tai Chi. And then whatever we discover here, whatever we can make happen in the body, that has to carry through every single posture. So these sinking down, releasing up movements are the beginning of every other posture in the form, or every other gesture or series, however we want to translate. Sure, Tai Chi gestures or dynamics. And there are other things that are happening, but if we lose that basic structure, it sort of ceases to be Tai Chi in a significant way. I want to finish off by looking at, usually we go through a whole set of self-massages afterwards, just to make sure nothing's getting stuck anywhere. We did that a little bit yesterday, and we do it in most classes, but today I'm going to do one of the ones in yesterday's class we skipped over, which is the abdominal massage, to help focus a little bit more on this area as well. So we did a lot of upper and lower coordination, sort of thinking of the body in two large areas of influence. But Tai Chi also really uses a three-part model much of the time. So if there's an upper and a lower, that by definition means there's a middle. We were really looking at it when we were doing deeper bows, back and forth, using the waist as the pivot. And here's a very useful massage for helping wake that area up. I'm going to start with my hands at my navel, standing in about body width, slightly wider, sitting back in the hips, chin in, crown up, spine long. Same basic posture. And initially, I'm just going to turn my body from side to side. So this is going to be another one of those hip turns. Right. Folding in on one side, stretching open gently on the other side. And I do mean gently. It's not supposed to be a big stretch. The legs will stay pretty stable. Feel a very slight movement of the knee front to back. And the whole upper body is just going along for the ride. So there's no turn really from my waist, nothing from my shoulders. My head isn't leading, which is a very common initial challenge for people, not to lead with the head from side to side. And while I do this, I'm going to try to keep my hands just where they are in space. So it'll feel like I'm almost massaging my hands with my body. So my hands are just going to stay right in the middle, and I'm turning my body back and forth. So when I'm turning to one side, my hands end up on the opposite side. And if I feel a very subtle twist in the waist area or the lower back, that's fine. I don't have to exclude it. In fact, leaving the hands sort of behind in this way is going to encourage just a little feeling of rotation in that area, which can help relax the lower back a little bit. Now I can do the same thing for the up and down, but when I do the complete exercise, I'm not going to be moving my head this way, looking up and down. But just to get a sense of counterbalance initially, I can think of looking up and again bending back from the waist. But if I leave my hands behind, they end up below the navel. Come back to the middle, hands are back at navel height without having gone anywhere. Bowing forward is going to tend to pull them a little bit above the navel. If I bow, again, all the way down through the waist area. Now this is a little misleading because I'm not going to be doing this movement in the final version, but just sort of getting the feeling of leaving the hands behind again, and getting some vertical movement that way. So I'm going to go back to the side, and then drop my hands under the navel, and then let them come up on the other side. So whenever I'm in the middle, my hands are on the center line, but they're always going to be now above or below the navel, just making a little circle around. And if you can remember those magnetic toys, really cheap toys from when you were a kid, which was basically just a piece of cardboard with a little plastic lid on it, filled with iron shavings, and they gave you a little magnet, and then you could draw things, right? Like had a little face in it, you could move the hair around with the beard and trace things with the iron filings just by pulling them around with the magnet. So the magnet's influence passes through the little plastic sheet that covers it. That's as good a metaphor as I can think of for what this feels like a little bit. Your hands being a little like the magnet, the surface of your abdomen being like that plastic sheet. And then something you can feel is being dragged around underneath. And you may not feel that right away. But it gives you the idea of what it is you're looking for, I think, in terms of the sensation. If I go just back to side, sort of feel like something deeper in the abdomen is getting dragged from one side to another. And if I go back and doing the circle, and I can feel that kind of deeper influence. And gradually, let that spread out a little bit, just by making the circle a little bigger. Moving towards the borders of the abdomen. So the navel still is the center. Pausing at the top, just under the breastbone. And sometimes you'll still feel some kind of internal movement, as if we've been stirring up a bowl. Things are circling around, take a minute for them to settle. Now I'm really mixing my metaphors between stirring, filings and whatsoever. It's bad poetry, that was tempting poetry. Mixed metaphors. And now I'm going to change direction. So whichever way I was circling before, I'm just going to reverse that. And there are suggested or even described directions for these sorts of things, but initially we're really just looking for a feeling. And we're just using the principle that if it's good to go one way, then it's good to go the other way and balance things out after a while. Once you start to get a little bit of that feeling, or at least the basic coordination, you can gradually circle in back toward the navel. the main idea is that when I'm turning to the right side, my hands are on the left, and when I'm turning to the left side, my hands are on the right. Not because I'm micromanaging again, but because I can just sort of leave the hands behind as I turn. The shoulders are very relaxed, sinking the weight the whole time, sitting back in the hips. The breath is very slow, deep, even, and much slower, as long as that's comfortable for you, much slower than sense of gathering, whatever it is I can feel, if anything, back to the center of the abdomen. And if we're going to borrow a little bit from the rest of Chinese medicine, which Qigong and even Tai Chi do to some degree, the navel area, like this lower rib area, is associated with the digestive function. The digestive function, not just in terms of breaking out food, but in a very broadly defined way of the transmission of nutrients to every part of the body, and thus the strengthening of the muscles and connective tissue and the limbs in general. At the end, I can let my hands settle down so they're also covering the area just below the navel. Feel the breath gathering there. Now we did a lot with our weight on both legs, all the side squat. We didn't do a lot of, we did some weight shifting, but we didn't do a lot that was stretching out our legs. So if they're feeling a little stiff after the last hour, I can always just turn out one foot, take a little step, with the back foot, pivot to a comfortable angle, and just shift my weight forward, turning the hips towards that front leg. Still kind of drop the tailbone into the body and stretching out every part of that leg. With the knee a little bit straight, and getting that back heel down, stretches the hamstrings and the calf. But by dropping the tailbone under, I'll feel a little stretch in the front of the hip. That affects the psoas muscle. So there's, as well as the hip flexors, like the quads. And then I can even bend that back knee, let the heel come up. And then again, think of dropping the heel towards the floor, but keeping the knee deeply bent, which gives me a much deeper feeling of pull in the calf area. At first stretch, I felt the calf is more in the outer muscle, the gastrocnemius. This is much deeper in the soleus muscle, really just sort of one layer deeper. People, when they're stretching out, often neglect the soleus muscle, which arguably has a much bigger effect on the ankle and foot than the gastrocnemius. We'll change sides. The back knee is relatively straight, the heel is down on the floor. And then I'm turning my hips towards the front and dropping the tailbone under as much as I can, so I can feel some stretch in the front of the hip as well and down into the thigh. These kind of stretches can be done before Tai Chi as well. And then let that back heel come up, bend the knee, bend the back knee a lot, and then press the heel towards the floor while keeping the knee bent, which means the heel will not move very far. It's just the feeling, the action of pressing it towards the floor with a very deep pull in the back of the calf. A little bit over an hour, but that's okay. There we have some of the basics for Tai Chi. There's many other dynamics that could be discussed. It's sort of good starting place, as well as a pretty reasonable warm up, a preparatory routine for doing more involved Tai Chi routines. Anybody has any questions? Please let me know. Thank you for joining. Is that recording?